Okay, so get this. We have a whole bunch of sources all about this one spiritual movement, and it's got some really tangled roots. We're talking politics money, even some pretty dark accusations about like cult behavior.
Yeah, it really is striking how deep this group seems to be woven into like mainstream society, right? Like that's not something you usually see with groups that are facing accusations like these. It makes you wonder, how did they manage to fly under the radar for so long?
I know, right? And at the center of all this is this guy, Chris Butler. Now, from what we've gathered, he's a former Hare Krishna devotee
Yeah.
who decided to go his own way and start his own thing.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It's not what you'd expect, right? Like, it's not your stereotypical chanting on street corners
Ah,
kind of movement.
exactly. And we see that from Daruk Frankowski's Facebook posts, right? Like
Yeah.
Butler's followers are involved in all sorts of things. We're talking politics, yoga businesses, you name it. It's wild.
Yeah, and that just makes these accusations even more intriguing, doesn't it?
Totally. So let me get this straight. We've got Daruk, who seems like he was pretty deep in this movement, right? And he's definitely not holding back on his criticism. Then we've got these academic texts on cults and gurus and some old articles from the Honolulu Advertiser going all the way back to the 70s. Oh, and even some court documents about a film project in New Zealand. This is a lot to unpack.
Oh, it's a lot. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? We've got all these different angles we can look at this movement from.
Mhm.
You got the insider perspective, the scholarly view, media coverage, and even legal battles.
So let's get down to it. Our mission here, if you want to call it that, is to figure out what this movement is really all about. How it works, and if these accusations of cult-like activity are actually legit. Where do we even start with something that's complex?
Well, I think a good place to begin is with Chris Butler himself. And the movement he founded, it was originally called the Science of Identity Foundation, and it's rooted in Krishna yoga philosophy and chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. Does any of that ring a bell?
Yeah, it's interesting way because, like you said, Butler started with the Hare Krishnas, or ISKCon to be precise, before breaking away and forming this new group. But his followers definitely seem to operate way more under the radar than the Hare Krishnas we're used to seeing.
And that difference might be super important, you see, when someone abandons a traditional path like that, especially after taking vows like Sannyasa, the renounced life of a wandering holy man, and then starts building a following, accumulating wealth that raises some eyebrows.
Hold I need to back up a sec. When you say sannyasa, can you just give me a quick rundown on what that actually means and why is it such a red flag when someone ditches it like Butler did?
Sure. So sannyasa is like a really serious commitment in Hinduism. It's basically renouncing all worldly possessions and attachments, dedicating your life to spiritual practice and service. And traditionally, you don't just decide to undo that commitment. It's a major break from tradition.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this former Hare Krishna devotee who ditches sannyasa and starts his own movement. But Daruk also claims that Butler actually changed his teachings after leaving ISKCon. Like, are we talking a complete 180 or more, like, subtle shifts?
That's a good question. We don't have all the specifics on exactly how the teachings change, but the concern is that by breaking from that traditional lineage, Butler could be setting himself up as the sole authority. Like if there's no established scripture or anything to refer back to, then his word becomes law. And that's a classic power move we see in a lot of cult-like groups.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So we've got this former Hare Krishna devotee reinterpreting traditional teachings, amassing a following. And then to make things even more interesting, we've got this whole connection to politics. Apparently, Butler's movement is tied to a political party in Hawaii called the Independence for Godly Government, or IGG.
Yeah, and it's more than just a casual connection. We're talking multiple IGG candidates and officials, including Kapi Hoshijo, who ran for Congress, were also followers of Butler. I mean, think about that for a second. Were voters even aware of these connections? It really raises questions about transparency and influence.
Totally. And those old Honolulu Advertiser articles from the 70s, they were already reporting on this back then. Allegations about a lack of transparency regarding the links between the IGG Butler and his followers. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes, right? And then you add in the fact that there were these two newspapers, the Valley Isle and the Kauai Sun, that were allegedly run by IGG members and followers of Butler. It starts to feel like a concerted effort to control the narrative.
Okay, so control seems to be a big theme here, and it looks like that extends to finances too. Daruk claims that Butler was demanding, quote-unquote, double donations from his followers. What does that even mean?
Right, like were they donating twice as much as other devotees, or were they giving twice to different entities within the movement? It's not entirely clear, but definitely sounds shady.
And it gets even shadier. Daruk also alleges that Butler would pressure followers to give him money patents, copyrights, even entire businesses. And get this, he claims Butler would threaten to stop eating and drinking if people didn't comply. It's wild.
It's a serious accusation, and it really makes you question the ethical boundaries within this movement, right? Like, are we
Yep.
talking about genuine spiritual devotion or something more coercive?
Yeah, and especially considering how involved Butler's followers seem to be in these different businesses. Like there's Wailana Yoga, which is pretty popular, and then this other one, Ninja Gang, which seems a bit more niche.
So the question is, were these legitimate business ventures, or were they just channels to funnel money back to Butler and his inner circle?
Yeah.
And were the followers essentially working for free under the guise of, spiritual devotion?
Right, and that's something we'll have to dig into more. How were these businesses structured? Who was profiting from them? It's a whole other rabbit hole.
Totally. And speaking of rabbit holes, remember those court documents from New Zealand? The ones about that film project called The Lost Prince?
Oh, yeah. That's where things take a really strange turn, right?
Mhm.
We're talking allegations of mismanagement whispers that the film was a front for something else entirely, and accusations of a restrictive environment and control over the film crew's lives. It's like this whole project was shrouded in secrecy and potential wrongdoing.
Yeah, and then to top it all off, there's a lawsuit against the farmers who rented their property for the film production. It seems like things went south pretty quickly down in New Zealand.
Okay, so let me make sure I've got this straight. They've got potential financial irregularities, a
Well,
web of political connections, this strange film project, and all these accusations of manipulation and control. It's a lot.
yeah. It is, and it all comes back to that central question. Are these accusations of cult-like behavior actually valid? What are people specifically claiming about Butler and his movement? What behaviors are they pointing to? That's what we need to unpack next.
Wojciech is pretty vocal about his experience.
Yeah.
He claims that Butler would actually control the flow of information within the movement, even banning certain scriptures and knowledge.
Yeah.
It's like he was trying to create his own version of reality.
And that's something we see a lot in cult-like groups, right? Like, by limiting access to outside information, the leader can maintain their authority and prevent followers from questioning their teachings.
Yeah.
It's all about creating a closed system where the leader's word is the ultimate truth.
Right, and it gets even more disturbing. Duruk also alleges manipulation and psychological abuse, even hinting at the possibility of physical violence. It's scary stuff.
It is. We definitely need to approach those claims with a critical eye, but they do align with a pattern of behavior we see in many cults. And think about it. If you're constantly being told that the outside world is evil and corrupt and that only the leader can offer salvation, it can create a really powerful sense of dependency.
It's like they're being brainwashed,
Yeah.
right? And then you add in those non-disclosure agreements that Rama Ranson mentioned, and it really starts to feel like a system designed to silence dissent and protect the leader at all costs.
Absolutely. NDAs can be incredibly problematic. They create this culture of fear and secrecy, which makes it really difficult for people to speak out, even if they're being harmed.
But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. We've got all these serious accusations, but then you have someone like Tulsi Gabbard, a former congresswoman, who publicly defends Butler and credits him with giving her this wonderful spiritual practice. So how do we reconcile those two completely different experiences?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we really need to grapple with. It is possible for someone to have a positive experience within a group, even if there are elements of manipulation or abuse happening at the same time. Remember, these groups often attract people who are searching for meaning and purpose, and they can offer a really strong sense of belonging and community that's hard to find elsewhere.
So are you saying it's possible that Tulsi Gabbard was just unaware of the darker side of the movement? Or maybe she chose to ignore it because she was benefiting from her connection to Butler?
It's hard to say for sure, but what's important is that we acknowledge the complexity of the situation. It's not a black and white issue. We need to be careful about painting everyone involved with the same brush.
Okay, I hear you. So let's try to understand how this movement operates, even if we can't definitively label it as a cult or not. Our sources offer some really interesting details about the specific teachings and practices that might shed some light on things. There's this recurring theme of separating oneself from the material world, which is seen as inherently corrupt and distracting. Derek even mentioned Butler discouraging followers from engaging in certain activities and consuming certain types of knowledge, all in the name of spiritual purity.
Yeah, that's a classic tactic we see in a lot of cults. It's about creating that us versus them mentality, isolating followers from outside influences, and controlling the flow of information. It's all designed to reinforce the leader's authority and maintain control.
Derek also talks about this idea of complete surrender to the guru. He claims that Butler emphasized unquestioning obedience as the only path to true liberation.
And that's really the core of it, right? The over-veneration of the leader is a hallmark of so many cults followers are taught to see the guru as this infallible being, the sole source of truth and guidance. And that creates a power imbalance that can be really easily exploited.
And it seems like exploitation might have been a recurring issue here. Daruk claims that Butler would pressure followers to devote their time, energy, and resources to the movement, often to their own detriment. He even alleges that Butler would use guilt trips and emotional manipulation to get people to do what he wanted.
And those kinds of tactics can be incredibly insidious. They prey on people's insecurities and their desire to please, which makes it really difficult for them to recognize the abuse and stand up for their own needs.
It's starting to feel like there's a really disturbing pattern emerging. But I still keep coming back to Tulsi Gabbard's positive experience. How do we make sense of that in light of everything else we're learning?
It's a good reminder that these situations are rarely black and white. It's possible for someone to have a genuinely positive experience within a group that also exhibits harmful or manipulative behaviors, and that doesn't invalidate the experiences of those who felt harmed. It just adds another layer of complexity to the story.
So where do we go from here? It feels like we're wading through this swamp of conflicting information. What can we definitively say about Chris Butler and this movement at this point?
I think we can say that there are some serious accusations of cult-like behavior that definitely warrant further investigation. We can also say that the movement has been shrouded in secrecy, which makes it really difficult to get a clear picture of what's really going on.
So what does that mean for our listeners? How should they approach this information? Should they just dismiss Butler and his followers as a bunch of crazies?
Not necessarily, but they should be aware of the potential for manipulation and abuse within any group, especially one that demands unquestioning devotion. It's important to be discerning and to trust your gut if something feels off.
So we need to be cautious and critical, but also open to the possibility that there might be more to the story than meets the eye. It's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and that's why it's so important to keep asking questions, to do your own research, and to be willing to challenge your own assumptions,
Yeah. It's so tempting to want a simple answer, right?
Yeah.
Like to be able to categorize this movement as either good or bad, but the reality is much more nuanced than that.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's forcing us to confront the complexities of belief, the allure of charismatic leaders, and the potential for both good and harm within spiritual groups.
Okay, so what are some concrete steps our listeners can take if they want to learn more about this movement? Where should they start?
Well, I'd encourage them to start by digging deeper into the groups we've mentioned, the Science of Identity Foundation, the Independence for Godly Government, Waylana Yoga, see what information is available online, read articles, watch videos, and try to get a sense of their beliefs and practices.
And what about the individuals involved? Should they be researching Chris Butler, Tulsi Gabbard, Daruk Frankowski, and others?
Absolutely. It's important to understand the perspectives of the people involved, both those who support the movement and those who have spoken out against it. Look for interviews, articles, social media posts, anything that can help you get a better sense of who these people are and what motivates them.
Okay. And what about those academic texts on cults that we mentioned earlier? Are those worth checking out?
Definitely familiarizing yourself with the common characteristics of cults can help you better evaluate the information you're gathering. It can also help you develop a more critical lens for analyzing groups and leaders in general.
So we're essentially encouraging our listeners to become like amateur investigators, right? To take what we've discussed and use it as a springboard for their own research.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It's not about giving you all the answers, but about sparking your curiosity and encouraging you to explore further.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the sunny beaches of Hawaii to the rolling hills of New Zealand. But we've only just scratched the surface of this complex and multifaceted story.
And that's the exciting part, right? There's still so much to uncover.
I know, but for now we need to take a breath and process all this information.
Do?
But you should say we shift gears and explore something a bit lighter for the rest of our time today.
Honestly, that sounds like a great idea. Sometimes you need a little mental palate cleanser after delving into such heavy subject matter,
I totally agree. But before we move on, any final thoughts for our listeners on this deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation?
Just a reminder to be critical, be discerning, and trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is.
Well said. And with that, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back to explore a completely different world. Well, Daruk's claims go even deeper than just controlling information. He says Butler would actually pressure followers to give him money, like straight-up cash patents, copyrights, even entire businesses.
Yeah, that's a whole other level, isn't it? It really raises questions about the line between, spiritual guidance and financial exploitation.
I know, right? And it gets even crazier. Daruk claims that Butler would threaten to stop eating and drinking if people didn't give him what he wanted. Like, how do you even respond to that?
It's a pretty extreme form of manipulation, wouldn't you say? It makes you wonder what kind of psychological hold he had over these people.
Totally. And it makes those accusations of unpaid servants even more troubling.
Yeah.
Were these people working for free out of devotion, or were they being coerced and exploited?
It's a question we need to keep in mind as we go deeper into this, especially when we look at those businesses connected to the movement, like Wailana Yoga and Ninja Gang, where these legitimate ventures or something else entirely.
And then there's that whole film project in New Zealand, The Lost Prince, remember? It's like this bizarre side story with allegations of mismanagement and even whispers that the film was a front for something else.
Yeah, that whole thing is super shady, especially with those accusations of a restrictive environment and control over the film crew's lives. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story.
Okay, so let me recap. We've got potential financial irregularities,
Hmm.
a web of political connections, this strange film project, and all these allegations of manipulation and control. But the big question remains, are these accusations of cult-like behavior actually legit?
That's what we need to figure out, right? Let's break it down. What exactly are people claiming about Butler and his movement? What specific behaviors are they pointing to?
Well, one of the most common threads we see in the sources is this idea of isolating followers from the outside world. Daruk talks about Butler banning certain scriptures and knowledge, even discouraging certain activities. It's like he wanted to create his own little reality bubble.
And that's a classic cult tactic, isn't it? You control the information, you control the narrative, and you make yourself the sole source of truth.
Exactly. And then there's this emphasis on complete surrender to the guru. Dark claims Butler would demand unquestioning obedience from his followers, like it was the only path to enlightenment.
That's another huge red flag. That kind of blind faith and devotion can be easily exploited, especially when you have a charismatic leader like Butler.
And then you add in those non-disclosure agreements that Rama Ranson mentioned, and it really starts to feel like a system designed to silence dissent and protect the leader at all costs.
Totally. Those NDAs create a culture of fear and secrecy, making it incredibly difficult for people to speak out, even if they're experiencing harm.
It's like they're trapped, right?
Yeah.
Afraid to say anything for fear of repercussions.
Exactly. And that kind of environment can be incredibly damaging, both psychologically and emotionally.
So how do we reconcile all this with Tulsi Gabbard's positive experience?
Huh.
She clearly seems to have a very different view of Butler and his teachings.
It's a great question, and it highlights the complexity of these situations. Just because one person has a positive experience doesn't mean that others aren't being harmed. It's important to remember that.
So are we saying that Tulsi was just naive, or that she chose to ignore the red flags because she was benefiting in some way?
I don't think we can say that for sure, but it does raise some interesting questions about how people perceive and rationalize their experiences within these kinds of groups.
It's like maybe she was drawn to the positive aspects of the teachings and chose to overlook or minimize the more troubling aspects.
That's definitely possible, and it's something we see a lot with charismatic leaders. People are drawn to their message, their energy, their vision, and they might be willing to overlook certain things in order to maintain that connection.
It's like they're blinded by the light, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be critical, to ask questions, and to not be afraid to challenge authority, even when it's presented in a spiritual context.
So what are some other common characteristics of cults that our listeners should be aware of? What kind of red flags should they be looking for?
Well, one thing to watch out for is any group that demands absolute loyalty and obedience to the leader. They might use phrases like the guru is always right, or you must surrender completely to the master.
And those are red flags
Because it creates an unhealthy power dynamic.
Yeah.
One where the leader is elevated to a godlike status and followers are discouraged from thinking critically or questioning their teachings.
So basically any group that discourages critical thinking or independent thought is a potential cause for concern.
Exactly. And another red flag is any group that isolates its members from the outside world, either physically or emotionally. They might discourage contact with family and friends or limit access to information that challenges their beliefs.
Like they're creating their own little echo chamber, right? Where everyone reinforces the same ideas and no dissenting voices are allowed.
Exactly. And that can be really dangerous because it creates an environment where people are more susceptible to manipulation and abuse.
So what can our listeners do if they encounter a group or a leader that exhibits these kinds of red flags?
The most important thing is to trust your gut if something feels off. It probably is. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to do your own research, and to seek out independent information.
So basically, don't be afraid to be skeptical and to think critically, even when it comes to matters of faith.
Absolutely. And remember, there are resources available if you need help or support. There are organizations that specialize in cult education and recovery, and they can provide valuable guidance and support.
So if you're ever feeling unsure, or if you just want to learn more about the dynamics of cults and how to protect yourself, there are people out there who can help.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help.
Okay, so we've talked about the red flags, the potential for harm, and the importance of being critical. But what about the positive aspects of spiritual seeking? Are there any benefits to joining a spiritual group or following a guru?
Sure, there can be a lot of benefits to spiritual seeking. It can provide a sense of community purpose and meaning. It can help people connect with something larger than themselves, and it can offer guidance and support during difficult times.
So it's not all bad, right? It's just important to be aware of the potential risks and to choose wisely.
Exactly. Not all spiritual groups are cults, and not all gurus are manipulative or abusive, but it's important to be discerning, to do your research, and to trust your instincts.
So how do we find that balance between open-mindedness and healthy skepticism? How do we know when to trust a spiritual teacher and when to be wary?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It's a process of discernment, a journey of self-discovery, and ultimately it comes down to trusting your own inner wisdom.
So basically, we need to develop our own internal bullshit detector.
Exactly. And that takes time, experience, and a willingness to be honest with ourselves about what we're seeing and feeling.
So what are some questions our listeners can ask themselves when evaluating a spiritual group or a leader?
Well, one good question to ask is, does this group or leader encourage critical thinking, or do they demand blind faith and obedience?
And what about the role of the leader? Are they presented as infallible, or do they acknowledge their own human limitations?
That's another important question. Healthy spiritual leadership is about empowerment and guidance, not about control and domination.
And what about the financial aspect? Are there any red flags there?
Definitely watch out for any group that pressures you to give money or that uses guilt trips or emotional manipulation to get you to donate.
So basically, any group that makes you feel uncomfortable or pressured about money is probably not a good fit.
Exactly. And if you ever feel like you're being exploited or taken advantage of, don't be afraid to walk away.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from the red flags of cults to the benefits of spiritual seeking. It's a lot to process, but I think it's important to have these conversations, to raise awareness and to empower people to make informed choices about their spiritual lives.
I agree. It's all about education and awareness. The more we understand about these dynamics, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and to make choices that are aligned with our values and our well-being.
Well said. And with that, I think it's time to move on to a slightly lighter topic. What do you say we take a break from the heavy stuff and explore something a bit more fun and uplifting?
Honestly, that sounds fantastic. My brain could use a little break from all this cult talk.
Me too. All right, let's shift gears and talk about something completely different. Okay, so we just spent a lot of time in a pretty intense world.
Yeah.
A lot to think about, right? Like, it's kind of amazing how these groups can exist right under our noses, blending into everyday life.
I know, it's like they're hiding in plain sight, right? And it really makes you think about how we often just accept things at face value, especially when it comes to spirituality.
It's true. We tend to assume that spiritual groups are inherently good, and that can make us blind to the warning signs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why these deep dives are so important. They force us to question our assumptions, to look beyond the surface, and to consider all sides of the story.
Okay, so zooming out for a sec, what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind when they encounter any group or leader, especially one claiming spiritual authority? What are the red flags?
Well, the first thing is healthy skepticism. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions, to challenge claims, and to seek out information from different sources, not just what the group is telling you.
It's like that old saying, trust but verify, right?
Exactly. And also pay close attention to the power dynamics within the group. Is there a clear hierarchy? Does the leader demand total obedience? Are there systems in place to silence dissent? Those are all huge red flags.
And those are bad because
they create an environment where critical thinking is stifled and the leader's authority goes unchecked. It's a breeding ground for abuse.
Makes sense. So basically, any group that tries to isolate its members from the outside world, either physically or ideologically, should raise some serious concerns.
Definitely that kind of isolation creates an echo chamber where the group's beliefs are constantly reinforced and any dissenting voices are shut down. It's a recipe for manipulation.
So it sounds like a lot of this comes down to trusting your gut. If something feels off, there's probably a reason for it.
Absolutely. Our intuition is a powerful tool, and we should never dismiss it if something feels wrong, even if we can't quite put our finger on why it's worth paying attention to that feeling.
It's easy to second guess ourselves, especially in a group setting,
Yeah.
but those gut feelings are often there for a reason.
Exactly. They're like our internal alarm system, letting us know when something's not right.
Okay, so to sum it up, be skeptical, be observant, and trust your instincts.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule of thumb for navigating the world of spiritual groups and leaders.
So reflecting on everything we've discussed today, what are some of the bigger picture lessons we can learn from this deep dive?
Well, I think it's a reminder that spirituality can be a powerful force for both good and bad. It has the potential to inspire and uplift, but it can also be used to manipulate and control.
And it really underscores the importance of critical thinking, discernment, and the courage to question authority, even when it's presented in a spiritual context.
You said it, and it's a lesson that applies to so many areas of life, not just spirituality. We should always be willing to question the status quo, to challenge our assumptions, and to think for ourselves.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been quite the journey, hasn't it? We've explored some pretty dark corners of human behavior, but I think we've also come away with some valuable insights.
Absolutely, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to approach the world with a more critical and discerning eye, to ask questions, to trust their gut, and to never be afraid to seek out truth.
Well said to our listeners. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought and some tools to navigate the complex landscape of spiritual groups and leaders.
And remember, the journey of discovery doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep seeking truth.
That's right. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.